I'm joined by Bob McIlvaine, our very special guest. Bob's featured in the film, and Bob, unfortunately, I'm so sorry Bobby lost his son Bobby, 9/11, and we're so happy to have you here. And Bob's going to really share with us his story, and he's been doing so much work and was really involved with this project, but just not from the get-go. You kind of became involved with the project.
Yeah, well, I just want to briefly mention Bobby. He was a Princeton graduate and had just started working up at Merrill Lynch, which was right across the street from the North Tower. And that day he was murdered. And it took me, you spend at least 6 months grieving. So I really didn't think about 9/11. And but then I started having questions, and I made every 9/11 Commission hearing. And after those hearings, especially when Condoleezza Rice testified, that's when my real anger comes out. And I feel it's very important because I have so much anger. I have an obligation. My son was murdered, and the information that we got from the commission was just bogus. It was a fraud. And so with that anger, I've made it a mission that this is my job as a parent. My son was murdered. We've never, and I like everyone to put themselves in my position, that you have, or I have, an obligation to investigate my son's murder. And it's been a long, hard journey. A day like today is so emotional. I've been standing here crying because you're watching your son get murdered. That's the bottom line. And that's brutal. And that's why so many people don't want to deal with it, because it is such a brutal, brutal day. And you look at it and you think about how that person died. You think when your son or your child dies, you want to think about his last second. Well, standing here, that's all you think about. And so it is very difficult to do. But because of that, and because the anger I have, I just want to I want people to know my story, and it's very important.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for coming here to the KBDI studios and sharing this with us. And it's not easy, and we're so appreciative because we want to bring the deeper story into the community. So Bob's going to be back right now. Let's toss it on over to Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry and Bob. And Bob, I watched the DVD from beginning to end twice, and I saw you at every single one of those hearings. Every time they took a shot of somebody, you were in the background. So you were absolutely, we can't thank you enough, and the other members of the film, the director and the producer, being here with us again this evening. We also want to remind you that it's because of our viewers and our supporters and because of our members that we are even able to bring you this. This is the first time that 9/11 Press for Truth has been shown in the United States of America on broadcast television. It has been shown on some of the satellite and cable television stations. It's also been shown in theaters, as they point out, throughout the world. It's been shown in 37 different countries. The United States has not been one of them. And Bob McIlvaine, tell me a little bit more about your son, whom you lost on that day.
Well, I get so emotional talking about my son. Again, he was just a phenomenal. He was an intellect, academic, great athlete, and he had just started at Merrill Lynch 3 weeks before 9/11, and truly we were one of the lucky people, if you can call anyone lucky in 9/11, because we found his body. And we were able to take his body home, which is, you have...
something many of the families did not have.
And it's an extremely important point because, in the again, I've gone to all the 9/11 Commission hearings, and so many people have talked about explosions. Well, I hate to be gory here, but, you have people... men who are 6'3", 6'4", 250 pounds, and they can't find one trace of that man.
Right.
And you wonder, how in the world could that possibly happen? I think my son died from an explosion walking into the towers, but the 9/11 Commission would never even address those issues. You have firemen, you have policemen, and that's where my anger comes from, because again, my son was murdered.
Bob, do you not find that after the commission you actually had more questions? I felt watching the film as a viewer that I had more questions at the end than I did when I started watching it.
Well, there's no question about that, but you have to do your own research. And I do this every day of the week. And no one's proven to me that Osama bin Laden had anything to do with 9/11. The FBI came out and said we could not prove that he had anything to do about 9/11. We can't prove that these 19 Arabs did what they did. And I don't have that much time, but the main architect of 9/11 was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's down in Guantanamo. He's the fellow that they have waterboarded 183 times to get confessions. His whole story, there's 400 and some footnotes in the 9/11 Commission book, 1/4 of the footnotes, based on his confessions, his testimony from
being waterboarded.
What am I supposed to do as a parent?
Bob, we're going to talk a little bit about the scrambling of the aircraft, the fighter jets, which did not happen.
Yeah, well, to me, this is a really a big deal because my son, I think he was one of the first, I know he was one of the first 10 to die. He worked across the street from the North Tower, and there was a conference up on the 106th floor. So I know he was walking to the North Towers, and he did not enter the North Towers, and that's how he had died. And that's where I was talking about the explosions. But the important thing is, the first notification the FAA got about the planes was at 8:14, where they did not have any communications. Now, that's not necessarily a reason to believe that there was hijacking.
Well, a problem.
But anyway, at 8:20, if they followed standard procedures,
In the Northeast region.
in the Northeast region, American Flight 11 would have been stopped before they hit the towers, and my son would have lived.
And so they would have done that, and yet they didn't.
They didn't. And, you know, that's a long story. We get into the scrambling, when they scramble, and why they didn't scramble.
And 129 other times during that same year
it's a very important thing
they
to
did.
look into.
Thank you so very much. And again, we're honored to have you here
Thank
this
you.
evening.
It's such a long story to get it in that fast.
No,
It's
that's fine. Sherry, back to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Boy, we're having a great response, Kyle. Back with Kyle Hentz, producer from the film. And we've got more film on the way. What's coming up, Kyle?
Well, you're going to be introduced to a man named Paul Thompson. Paul Thompson was an environmentalist before he became the subject of our film, before he basically took up the cause of putting the pieces together of the events leading up to 9/11 and following 9/11 into a timeline. And it's that timeline that was a critical tool to the widows and the family members as they try to make sense of what happened, as they formulated their questions. They had Paul Thompson's complete 9/11 timeline as a reference. It was eventually published into a book, and we interview him extensively through most of the rest of the film. And he's a testimony to what one person, as is each one of the family members, can do when they set their mind to digging and determined to find out what the truth is. Do your own homework. We must be vigilant in a democracy. That's our responsibility.
You know, I was just talking to one of our great phone bankers here, and we've really had such a swell of positive comments and pledges, which are great. It means more programming like this coming to you in the future. But someone called in and said that this was a bunch of garbage and that they worked on the commission. If you're listening right now, I'd love to have you call back in and leave your phone number because I'd like to talk to you. But let's address this, Kyle, some of the negative response again around the film.
Well, we're asking people, for people who haven't asked sort of the first question or had the first doubts about what we were told, to suddenly be hit with a film or shown a film that begins to challenge that and sort of peel back the layers to show that the family members felt betrayed, many of them, not all of them, but many of them did, that most of their questions were not answered by the 9/11 Commission in their final report, that much of their investigation was based on fraud,
We're getting ready
testimony.
right now to go back to air. Kyle's got a lot of important stuff to say. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You know what? We're going to return to 9/11 Press for Truth right now, but Kyle's going to be back with us, and we're going to continue this conversation, so continue calling. Thank you. Thanks, Kyle.